Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Jeremy Corbyn is facing calls from 30 of his own MPs to commit to a softer option for Brexit. This morning, the Labour leader appeared to make some concessions to the group by effectively refusing to put a timeline on any transitional arrangements after Brexit, saying only that it should be less than 10 years. Sky senior political correspondent Robert Nisbet has the details.
EU flags flutter outside the Brighton Centre as Brexit dominates another party conference. These campaigners pushing for a tougher Remain stance from the Labour leadership.
It was good that they changed to 2 years staying in the single market, but it needs to go further.
30 MPs and party luminaries have added weight to the cause, signing a letter calling on Jeremy Corbyn to campaign on staying in both the customs union and the single market. Former frontbenchers joining the call.
It was a letter inherently talking about improving the rights of working people and protections of working people in this country. And I think that the debate on the freedom of movement has shifted away from where it should be.
Brexit is like the Monty Python foot coming down on our country. And for people like me, especially in London, where 650,000 jobs rely on being on the single market, I want the Labour movement to be part of leading the fight to protect those jobs as how we end austerities.
Others warn such a stance is incompatible with the result of the referendum.
You cannot leave the European Union and be a member of the single market and the customs union. You just can't do that. So they'd be more honest if they just said campaign to not leave the European Union. And of course there is a party that is supporting that, it's called the Liberals.
And with Jeremy Corbyn consolidating his grip on the party after a better-than-expected general election performance, there is little sign of movement. He wants a status quo transition period post-Brexit, the time to be determined.
At the moment, we're part of the single market, obviously. That has within it restrictions on state aid and state spending. That has pressures on it through the European Union to privatise rail, for example, and other services. I think we have to be quite careful about the powers we need as national governments.
So trouble looms on the conference horizon. Over 20 constituency Labour parties have filed motions demanding the party changes tack. They'll be boiled down to one so-called composite motion, and the language of that matters. In fact, 80% of the motions submitted suggest the Labour Party should campaign to remain in the single market and the customs union. And campaigners worry that if that language is watered down, it won't reflect the will of the party's members. Former Shadow Health Secretary Heidi Alexander says the party leadership can't ignore its members over Brexit.
It would be totally wrong if there was some sort of manoeuvring going on in the next 24 hours to try and keep that debate away from the conference floor.
Tomorrow's debate will underline the party's different post-Brexit approaches. It's not just the Conservatives who've been riven by how our departure is handled. Robert Nisbet, Sky News, Brighton.
Well, let's go to Brighton now to join our chief political correspondent, John Craig. And John, given the position that Jeremy Corbyn is coming to this conference at that success at the general election, getting 32 seats for Labour, you would have thought that the party would be rallying behind him in unity. Instead, some Labour MPs are using this conference as a chance to air their gripes.
Well, you'd expect a few grumbles in any political party. It has to be said that for the most part, the mood here is pretty vibrant. You saw the welcome Mr Corbyn got in the hall. But I can tell you behind the scenes there is something of what you might call a control freakery row, because we know that Mr Corbyn is only really allowing his closest allies to make speeches from the platform. For example, the Corbyn loyalist Ian Lavery is speaking at the moment. We heard from Andrew Gwynn earlier, Diane Abbott this morning. One Labour MP, a senior Labour MP, John Speller, has just told me that Labour MPs are being told they can't go in the hall and put their hands up to speak. They're being told to go and sit in the balcony. He says even in the Blair years, people like Dennis Skinner and Tony Benn were allowed to speak from the floor. That, of course, is on top of the row over Sadiq Khan and Andy Burnham. Now, the party hierarchy have relented over allowing Sadiq Khan to speak. He will speak tomorrow, but Andy Burnham, who of course is the former Cabinet Minister, former Shadow Cabinet Minister, stood against Mr Corbyn for the leadership in 2015. He's been banished, told he can't speak, and he's not very happy about it. He says it's a snub for the north of England.
I repeat a call I've made many times. They need to be less London-centric and give equal and prominent voice to the north. The party needs to take care to show its commitment to devolution. You know, it's a new movement that's building here. The election of mayors in the West Midlands, Greater Manchester, Liverpool City region. You know, it's a big change, and the party needs to show that it's embracing that change, indeed leading that change. And the failure to give a platform to people may lead some to say, well, they're not really committed, and I don't want people committing the Labour Party, questioning the Labour Party's commitment to devolution.
Well, in fairness, Andrew Gwynn and Ian Lavery are northern MPs, but Labour MPs are saying that not allowing Mr Burnham to speak is an own goal by the Labour leadership, and they pointed out, as the Tories have today, that their elected mayor in the West Midlands, Andy Street, he will get a hero's welcome at the Tory conference in Manchester next week. And irony of ironies, Mr Burnham is likely to be speaking at a fringe meeting at the Tory conference when he's been invited, but he's barred from the hall here, unless there's a sudden last-minute about turn, as there was with Sadiq Khan.
Sure, we'll be watching out for that. John Craig, thank you. Well, let's return to politics in the UK. Jeremy Corbyn has refused to put a time limit on a transitional deal after Brexit, saying only it should be no longer than 10 years after coming under pressure from his backbenchers. Well, from the Labour conference in Brighton, we're joined by the Shadow Communities and Local Government Secretary, Andrew Gwynn. Andrew, thanks so much for joining us on Sky News tonight. And you've been speaking today, taking a look back at how Labour did at the general election, saying that one thing you've learned from it, and one thing many people should learn, is not to underestimate Jeremy Corbyn after he was able to defy critics, to defy polls and gain those seats in the general election. So what's going on then? Why are members of your party underestimating Jeremy Corbyn with this letter? 30 MPs, MEPs, trade union leaders coming together and pushing for Jeremy Corbyn to remain, or to push the policy for the UK to remain in the single market. Are they underestimating your party leader?
Well, I don't think that it's about underestimating Jeremy. I think this is a united Labour Party. We're very buoyed up at this Labour Party conference, but we are a democratic party. There are differences in views and opinions across the party, and it's right that we debate those differences of views and opinions. But I know this, the Labour Party accepts the result of the referendum. We will work to make sure that our leaving the European Union works for working people, it works for the British economy, and you know, it's difficult to understand this, but we are not in the driving seat here. It's the minority Conservative government that are in the driving seat, and we will hold them to account to make sure we get the very best deal that we can. We're setting the agenda. Keir Starmer was the one that suggested that we're not going to be able to complete negotiations by the time we leave the European Union in March 2019, that we would need some form of transitional arrangements, and the Conservatives have now conceded that.
So you're saying that you've accepted we've voted to leave the EU, but then saying that Jeremy Corbyn, speaking this morning, has said that actually he will listen to those Labour members who are pushing for the UK to remain in the single market. That would be certainly turning your back on voters, Labour, Tory voters who voted to leave, and essentially any Labour voters who support Labour but also voted to leave. If you take on board these Labour MPs pushing for the UK to remain in the EU, you'll be turning your back on them.
Well, I think you're mixing up two things here. That we are leaving the European Union has been settled by the referendum and Article 50 has been triggered. The way that we leave the European Union is now what is up for negotiation. That's what the government are doing, and that is why Keir Starmer and the Labour Shadow Cabinet have set out some very clear red lines of what we would like to see, and we have said, and we have been consistent in saying it, it was in our manifesto as well at the general election, that we want to retain custom-free and tariff-free access to the European markets, because that is in the economic interest of the country. How we get that negotiated deal is a matter between now and March 2019 or beyond if we get transitional protections, but we need to make sure that we do not fall off an economic cliff edge.
Clear red lines. I'm not really sure we've actually heard anything clear from Labour in regards to how you would like to leave the EU. We had Tom Watson speaking to Neil Patterson this morning. He couldn't give any real clarity in terms of how you would like the UK to leave the EU. We've had Jeremy Corbyn hinting that potentially a transitional period could last up to 10 years. Keir Starmer has hinted towards 4 years. That's not very clear.
Look, the point is that we have said that this deal that the Conservative government will be negotiating is not going to be possible within the period between now and March 2019 because it's hugely complex. Nobody ever believed that leaving the European Union, unpicking 44 years of legislation, rules and regulations would be easy. So what we need to do is to make sure that we get the deal right. And that means that, as Theresa May has now conceded, we will need some form of transitional period. It needs to be as short as it needs to be and as long as it needs to be. I don't know how protracted the discussions and debates will be with the European Union, but you say that we haven't been clear. We've been absolutely clear. We want to protect the custom-free, tariff-free access to our European trading partners. That's something that will be negotiated. We want to keep cooperation on things like tackling international terrorism and crime and making sure that we are still part of bodies like Europol where we share information and intelligence. We have said that we will protect workers' rights and environmental protections. And we have said that we need to make sure that we have an immigration policy that doesn't cut off our noses to spite our faces. Those are the clear lines that we've set out.
You've said all of this before. It would be really good to find out exactly how you would like us to leave the EU, how long this transitional period would last for. I'm afraid, though, we have to leave it there. Andrew Gwen, really good talking to you. Thank you. Let's bring you some breaking news now from the Labour Party conference. It's just been announced that delegates at the conference will not vote on the party's policy on Brexit. Now, that's despite Jeremy Corbyn facing calls from 30 of his MPs to commit to the softest option for leaving the EU. Well, let's go to Brighton now to speak to our senior political correspondent, Robert Nisbet. Robert, what can you tell us about this?
There's a considerable amount of anger, I can tell you that, amongst some of the MPs who are hoping that the Labour Party would discuss what they believe is the best option for the Labour Party, which is to pursue a policy to remain in the single market and the customs union, not just in a transition phase, but to remain in it for the future. Now, they had put their names to this letter that you mentioned, 30 of them signing it, including some former front benchers of the Labour Party. Now, what happens at the Labour Party conference is that there are so-called contemporary motions issues. So the big burning hot topics of the day, they vote on whether there could be a vote on them later on at conference. And local constituency Labour parties decide what they think are the big issues that should be talked about. Now, in a ballot, Brexit was on it, and a number of these Labour parties, the constituency Labour parties, had put forward amendments where they said they wanted Labour to change its position to a much softer position to staying in the customs market, the customs union and the single market, but they did not get the votes needed, so therefore there will not be a vote on the Brexit position of the Labour Party. Now, one of those who signed the letter is the MP Stella Creasy, who spelled out to us a little earlier on just why she thinks it's important that there should have been a vote.
Brexit is like the Monty Python foot coming down on our country, and for people like me, especially in London where 650,000 jobs rely on being on the single market, I want the Labour movement to be part of leading the fight to protect those jobs as how we end austerity.
So why didn't Brexit get in there when it seems to be the only thing that people are talking about at these party conferences? Well, some smell a rat here and suggest that Momentum, the hard-left campaigning group, have been agitating and trying to get people not to vote on Brexit because many of them don't support continued membership of the EU anyway, and certainly don't want to see us staying in the single market and the customs union afterwards. Heidi Alexander, the former Shadow Health Secretary, spoke to Sky News a little bit earlier on as well, and she said how important it was that there should be a vote on this topic.
It would be totally wrong if there was some sort of manoeuvring going on in the next 24 hours to try and keep that debate away from the conference floor.
Now, the Labour leadership has said Brexit is still going to be discussed. OK, there won't be a vote on the policy, but it will still be talked about, and all the views from people like Heidi Alexander will be filtered back into the Labour leadership. And as for that letter that was signed by those 30 Labour luminaries, Caroline Flint, the Labour MP, says perhaps they should be looking to join another party if they're not happy with Jeremy Corbyn's stance on the issue.
You cannot leave the European Union and be a member of the single market and the customs union. You just can't do that. So they'd be more honest if they just said campaign to not leave the European Union. And of course there is a party that is supporting that. It's called the Liberals.
But to give you an indication of just how angry some MPs are that motion is not going to be voted on tomorrow, I've had a text from one who said that this is a stitch-up by Momentum, using their app, telling delegates which way to vote. So much for party democracy. This is absurd.
Spoke to the community's Shadow Community Secretary Andrew Gwynn earlier. He said that the party's united. Doesn't really look like that. And Robert, thanks very much.
The Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has resisted calls from some in the party to pledge to keep Britain in the European single market after Brexit. With their annual conference beginning in Brighton today, 30 Labour MPs were among those who signed a letter suggesting workers would suffer if market access was restricted. But Mr Corbyn told the BBC that staying in could hamper a future Labour government's ability to protect jobs. There will be no Brexit debate or vote during the conference. Here's our political correspondent, Eleanor Garnier.
You can take your party's conference out of Westminster, bring it to the beachfront in Brighton, but Brexit will follow you everywhere.
OK, here we go, 5 seconds to air.
He doesn't mind. He's got a spring in his step. After a better than expected election result, Jeremy Corbyn's no longer fighting for his leadership, but pitching himself as a Prime Minister in waiting.
We need at least 2 terms of a Labour government to start to address issues of poverty, injustice and inequality in Britain, and to build the houses that we need in this country.
Jeremy Corbyn's certainly safe in his job, but he's dealing with division in his party over Brexit. He argues leaving the single market will make it much easier to protect British workers and industry.
We need to look very carefully at the terms of any trade relationship, because at the moment we're part of the single market. Obviously that has within it restrictions on state aid and state spending, that has pressures on it through the European Union to privatise rail, for example, and other services. I think we have to be quite careful about the powers we need as national governments.
But more than 40 senior Labour figures are pushing the leader to commit to staying in the single market after the UK leaves the EU.
If you want frictionless trade and you want to put jobs first, the only way, in my view, you can do that is by staying permanently a member of the single market.
Come on, Corbyn, keep us in! Come on, Corbyn, keep us in!
Jeremy Corbyn's position and his policies in the party are now almost unchallenged. But you don't need to come far at this conference to see where division does actually lie, on the crucial issue of Brexit.
I support Corbyn, I support Momentum. I want a socialist programme in this country, but you need money for that. And if we leave the single market and the customs union, we'll be an impoverished country. We won't have money to even maintain things as they are.
Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister would be great, but parties come and go, and we need to be in the EU. That's the most important thing.
If you vote for us,
No doubt there's high spirits among party members, but even with Jeremy Corbyn's now tight grip on Labour, the biggest issue of the day, the UK's journey out of the EU, will ensure there'll be plenty of disagreements too. Ellen Agagna, BBC News, Brighton.
Well, divisions here have opened over Brexit among senior Labour figures, with Jeremy Corbyn facing calls from 30 high-profile party members to commit the party to keeping the UK in the single market and customs union, whatever the cost. And Theresa May's Florence speech continues to highlight cabinet differences on Brexit too, with a war of words over whether or not Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson influenced the speech. Our political editor Gary Gibbon is in Brighton at the Labour Party conference. Gary.
Well, as you say, a headache still for both main party leaders' Brexit. Away from here, it looks like the plan that Theresa May unveiled in Florence, the transition plan in particular, is getting a bit of pushback from some Eurosceptics in the cabinet, not least perhaps the Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson, who's unhappy with the idea that during that transition of 2 years or so, it could well be that the EU can come up with new laws and regulations which Britain isn't even in the room to discuss, and that we would have to obey those laws and regulations. So you can sense there that's the sort of saga that has some real potency to it. Here in the last few minutes, Jeremy Corbyn has successfully dodged a debate on Brexit. There will be a general one here, quite a short one, with Keir Starmer speaking, but what he didn't want was a specific debate on a specific motion that could entrap him into a policy he didn't want, like, for instance, say, support for the single market. He's avoided that. Slightly embarrassing to have ducked a debate on such an issue, but he'll think that's the lesser of two evils. Here's how the conference got underway here today.
A cheer just for coming on stage. And a chant too. Even Tom Watson sang along. Outside, record numbers of delegates were still queuing to get in. Party membership transformed. You're living in New York at the moment.
I am indeed.
And where were you living before that?
London.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Yes, some people would say you're typical sort of Glastonbury sort of set, the new Labour pool of support that Jeremy Corbyn has.
Well, I mean, clearly this is not true. I mean, I've lived in many different places in London, but I mean, if you look at this conference, you see, from all over the country.
You first timers? Yeah. Oh, brilliant. So where have you come from?
Basingstoke.
Same for you?
Yeah, Basingstoke.
I just bumped into one of the old guard up there. He was a special advisor when Labour was in government, a guy just walking in there. He said, it doesn't feel like my party anymore. There's people here from, too many people from London and Surrey, like you two, too many people from Glastonbury, he said.
Yeah.
Has he got a point?
We're all citizens of this country. It seems a bit silly to be critical of particular people developing an interest. You should welcome everyone and not care about what part of the country they're from. That's not relevant.
I would say I think there's a valid worry that we're losing our working class support.
Inside, new delegates were amongst those calling for Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London and a critic of Jeremy Corbyn's, to be denied a speaker slot.
No offence, but we see him on TV all the time. I spend all my evenings stalking famous MPs and speakers in bars. I want you to give us some speaking time for members, for volunteers, for activists, for the people that got us so far in the general election. Right?
We should have a spot for our mayors to our over the CAC to reject these calls, to block our champions of local government from speaking at our conference.
Conference. Whether you agree or not with a speaker, please be respectful on all sides, please.
There was heckling and some booing after only 10 minutes of speakers from the floor. Outside, a different chant. Pro-European Union campaigners said Labour should fight to stay in the EU. Jeremy Corbyn in interviews is still sounding wary of staying in the single market.
At the moment, we're part of the single market, obviously. That has within it restrictions on state aid and state spending. That has pressures on it through the European Union to privatise rail, for example, and other services. I think we have to be quite careful about the powers we need as national governments.
I think the best bet for this country is to remain within the single market. In fact, I would go further and say we should remain within the European Union, a reformed European Union, a changed European Union, but one step at a time.
You were on the front bench with Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell. You know exactly what their thinking is. You've got a hell of a job trying to convert them to that line of argument.
Do you know what? I think the one thing, the great thing about Jeremy and John is that they think things through, and they have.
You don't rule out them coming around to your point of view?
No, I don't. I think it's possible.
Today, I'm proud to announce we have 570,000 members, making the British Labour Party the largest political party in Europe.
The party's General Secretary was stopped in his tracks by another chorus from the floor. Delegates serenading their hero, not 2 cents, for the last time this week. Gary Gibbon, Channel 4 News at the Labour Party conference in Brighton.
Well, a little earlier I spoke to the Shadow Home Secretary, Diane Abbott. She has declared Labour will adopt a reasonable approach to managing migration. And I began by asking her if that meant the party's commitment to ending freedom of movement.
Immigrants play a really important role in our economy, and EU migrants are vital to the health service, education and social services. And therefore, we don't want to see important services collapse.
But what is a reasonable level? What's the figure?
The level of migration should reflect the needs of the economy and also issues about EU migrants being able to bring their families in and out.
One of your own Labour MPs, Clive Lewis, has said today that managing migration ultimately is about racism. Do you agree with those sentiments?
I don't think Clive Lewis is accusing me of racism. And one of the things I said at conference today is whatever we do about migration policy, it will be framed by Labour values. That's what people are looking to Jeremy and myself for, and that is what they will get. There is no scenario in which we are going to scapegoat migrants for issues around public services in the economy. In terms of staying in the single market, we hope that transition period will be as short as possible, but it may well have to be as long as is necessary.
Now, you've made a very passionate case for recruiting more police officers and firefighters. How do you think you can do that and end austerity and pay for Brexit?
Oh, we had a fully costed manifesto, and how we will pay for the 10,000 police officers and the 3,000 firefighters is by reversing some of the Tory tax cuts for the wealthy, such as capital gains taxes.
OK, let's just move on to the Labour Party more generally. You say you're throwing open conference to the membership, but isn't it the case that those invited to speak are those that agree with Jeremy Corbyn?
Not at all, not at all. What I think some journalists and commentators forget, that there was a time when conference was all about the delegates. And Jeremy wants to return to a position where it's the delegates' conference and the widest range of delegates get to speak. This morning, we had delegates speaking who weren't necessarily supportive of Jeremy Corbyn.
One of the problems you face, though, you say you want to put delegates first. The delegates seem to be at odds with Jeremy Corbyn on his position on the single market.
Well, we're going to have a debate on that. I think you'll find, as in the general election, that Labour Party delegates trust the Labour Party rather than Conservatives to get the best possible Brexit, a jobs Brexit, an economy Brexit, and a Brexit that reflects Labour values.